Actor strike is over. Everybody back to work. But let's take a look at the new contract, shall we? Hey there, folks. Yes, the SAG-AFTRA strike is over effectively. Like, they have an agreement. It has been cleared by the initial sort of committee that it needs to clear within SAG-AFTRA. The members have to vote to finally ratify it. That'll happen in a little bit. The odds are very likely that the vote will ratify the agreement. Not everyone loves it, but that's actually kind of the case pretty much every time. The expectation is that it will clear that, and things are starting to pick up again with that in mind, including me getting back to my regular work schedule as it was before the strike, or at least working on that. That having been said, this is a bit more complicated because, can I be honest, wrapping up this strike took longer than I thought, especially in the wake of the writer's strike wrapping up. In fact, at the time the writer's strike wrapped up, I had my thumbnail guy, Joel, mock together this because I thought it would effectively wrap up almost immediately after the writers and have a similar outcome. And I'm not going to be using that thumbnail, not because the deal is like a disaster or anything, but just because it's a lot more complicated. It's not as unambiguous a victory as the Writers Guild results were. So there's a fair amount of stuff to go over. Of course, the main stumbling thing for why this is not as clear-cut we got pretty much everything we want. I say we, I'm not a member of either guild, but I support both unions. So feels like a victory for folks in general. But yes, it's not just a case of like with the Writers Guild where it was they got basically everything that they were asking for, and it really did just make the studios look like absolute jerks for taking so long to give in on these points. With the actors, clearly there was actually more give and take that had to happen, particularly with the realm of AI. But since AI is the most complicated, we're going to table that. We're going to come back to that further down the line. But before I even get into any other stuff, because there's other stuff in that contract, even though AI is sucking up all the oxygen in the room and it's the main point of contention, there's other stuff to go over, which I think is interesting and pretty much all good. But before I get into any of this, a couple of caveats. Because this was technically also the case with the Writers Guild one, but again, the Writers Guild agreement was not as mired in some very harsh reactions that I've started to see to this thing. So there's a couple of things I want to put up front. The first is, I'm not a contract lawyer. Probably shouldn't need to tell you that, but just making it clear. I have looked over the available information to the best of my ability and interpreted it to the best that I'm going to be able to do. Are there going to be ways that it could go or possible holes in what's there or whatever that I am not able to see? Yeah, absolutely. That's why they don't have me negotiating this stuff. But here's the other thing I want you to keep in mind, especially before you start throwing at me any arguments that you are seeing being made, especially on Twitter right now, about why this is a bad deal. What is currently publicly available is the summary. Now, the summary is 18 pages long and fairly detailed, but it is not the contract. It is the summary. Now, the reason I want to bring that forward is because obviously the actual agreement, the full, detailed, granular agreement, has a lot more to it, a lot more specific wording, a lot more really nailed down stuff, probably more definitions. Does that mean that anything that looks like it might be a loophole in the summary is definitely covered in the full version? No, it doesn't mean that. But it also means that when I see people getting really uppity, insisting, well, it says this and that means that, and painting it in the worst way possible, I feel the need to point out, like, that's the summary you're reacting to. Again, you point out flaws. It's not a flawless thing. But let's all take a breath and realize that what we have access to, what pretty much everyone is reacting to, is a summary. So we still presume that the summary is accurate to the intention of the final thing. Therefore, I will be talking about it. But anyone who starts getting really nitpicky about the granular details, realize they don't have the actual details. Okay? Because I'm already seeing, just on Twitter alone, which granted is a hive of scum and villainy where fights will break out at any moment. But even within that, I've seen things get real heated real fast. But again, we're going to put AI aside because there's a fair amount of other stuff to talk about. So let's go over some of that. First of all, a raise. General raise across the board. The general raise is 7%. The raise for background performers is actually higher. It's 11%. And then for both, there will be subsequent raises of 4% next year and then 3.5% the year after that. But the whole thing has actually pretty clearly been crafted with a much stronger eye on the people who just get paid scale, i.e. minimum wage for actors. A lot of the real detailed specifics are covered in that. And there's actually, eventually when we get to the AI, even a few cases where if you are a Schedule F union member, i.e. the biggest names and the biggest stars, some of the stuff doesn't automatically apply to you. And while it doesn't say that in the contract, my assumption would be as part of the reason for that is when you are at the upper echelons, you have your own contract people, you have lawyers poring over these things, whereas all the people on the lower end can't afford that, and they need a good blanket strong overall contract covering everybody. So there actually does seem to be a pretty good heavy emphasis on benefiting the people at the bottom of the totem pole, at least in terms of what they're getting paid and how much work they're getting as much as possible, which I think is overall a good thing. And this raise and how it's structured is kind of indicative of that. Next up, intimacy coordinators are going to be required for any scene that is a sex scene or involves nudity. This is also good. This has become a little bit of an increasing issue in filmmaking in general, but in Hollywood in particular, because there's a very, very, very long history of performers, usually women actors, but like actors across the board being taken advantage of, put into positions where they feel uncomfortable, and just generally being coerced into work that they might not be comfortable with because they are having to deal directly with the director and or producer who's pushing them to do what they're not comfortable with. And an intimacy coordinator is there to ensure that, everything happens as was agreed in advance for the people going into this scene. That includes coordinating things like who's going to be on set, how the behavior is going to be, how it's going to be shot. Intimacy coordinators are not there to stop nudity and sex scenes from happening. They are there to make sure that when they do happen, they happen as securely and ethically as possible. This is a good thing. And yes, I have heard the thing from some actors, generally the older generation, who have, usually men, who have had complaints that an intimacy coordinator would impede their ability to perform a scene like that. Like, it would make it difficult to be present in what is meant to be conveyed as an intimate moment for the camera when there's somebody right there watching what you do, make sure you do what was agreed to and don't cross the line. And while I do understand, because I've seen enough things like that, in some cases it really does come across like grumpy old men who don't want to be told what to do, but it has come from a couple of actors who it felt more legitimate. And I do understand that it can be difficult, especially if it's not something you're used to having there and how it could throw you off. But my answer to that is tough. It is more important for everyone who is having to be naked and in close physical proximity to each other and being filmed, even if the nudity is not total or is being masked in some way. Like, comfort is more important. We can edit around how good your performance is, to be frank, and people's comfort is more important than that. So while I get it, and I'm not going to say that that is a completely invalid concern, suck it up and get over it. Next up, this one's interesting. Principal actors will be consulted on hair and makeup and not just kind of thrown into a hair and makeup trailer with no saying what's going on. This might seem like a little bit weird to have. This actually has a pretty big impact on actors who are people of color, because what's been a bit of a recurring issue on a lot of film sets is black hair especially is different from white hair. It behaves differently, it needs to be treated differently, it needs to be handled differently in terms of the health of the hair and also in terms of getting it to do what you want it to do. And not all hairdressers know how to do both. And it's become a bit of a recurrent issue on some sets and filming locations for TV and movies where performers of color with specific needs for their hair and makeup are being put in the hands of a hair and makeup team that don't know how to work with them. And the results are either uncomfortable or just poor. It just looks bad when that's not what's supposed to happen. So this is an effort to address that, and also has a caveat where if the shoot and the studio or whoever has not been able to provide this and the performer has to bring in their own people, they are going to be reimbursed for the cost of bringing in someone who they know knows how to deal with their hair. So again, I think this is pretty much a good thing. Next up, we got something that kind of crosses over and actually pretty much mirrors what went on with the WGA, and that is bonuses for streaming. Now, like the WGA, actors and the SAG-AFTRA union are going to start seeing the numbers for the actual streaming, because that was part of the contention. Numbers and actual viewing percentages, etc., have not been public. They don't have to be, not the way that things on broadcast television are. So while that information will still not be made public, it should be, but it will still not be made public. At the very least, people who should be getting bonuses and residuals based off being in something really successful will now have access to that information. And it also sets a structure where if a show or a film is viewed by 20% of the subscriber base of that service, 20% or more, they get a bonus on that. Now, that is a threshold that, at least so far as the metrics and the people who have been monitoring this, because as I said, streaming numbers don't get made public, but there are analysts who look at this and have a general idea of how things turn out. Something doing that well is going to be something that is a big hit. It's not super common for something to hit a 20% saturation or higher, but it is also not an impossible metric. Things that are generally considered to be big hits on streaming tend to hit that. So that seemed like a good balance and a good number. And I believe it is also the same one that the WGA was using to structure its bonuses for successful streaming shows. So that is pretty much the same deal. The one other thing before we start trying to parse all the AI stuff has to do with audition tapes and audition streaming, Zooms, anything like that. Basically, anything where an actor is either submitting a video or doing an audition remotely in some fashion, whether it be for health and safety concerns, physical limitations because they have some kind of disability, or they're just not physically able to make it to the audition space. That is something that has been allowed for a while, but there were some problems with how it was structured. Some of the big ones being there would often be a minimum, like the picture quality has to at least be X. I don't know what it was, but like some of these places, some of these casting places or directors or studios or whatever would basically expect it to look at least this good to a degree that actors who, if you're going in for an open audition, you're not a name, and they would have to shell out for higher end production stuff. They'd have to get lights and good cameras and a good sound equipment that is just money that they shouldn't have to spend when all that's being judged is their ability to perform a scene, not how well the scene can be shot in their home. So guardrails have been put in place for that, where where the casting directors and whatnot cannot set those kinds of expectations for how good the visual quality of the video is. Obviously, like if it's so bad you can't even hear them, yeah, they probably won't use that. But they can't be like, if you send it in 4K or we don't want it. They can't do anything like that. And they kind of could before. Also, some things in regards to putting up guidelines for what happens to those audition videos after the casting process. Because when a casting is hosted, by the either the casting company or the studio or whatever, they're shooting it on their equipment. They own that footage. But there wasn't really clear guidelines on what happens to audition material not shot by these people, but sent to them. There are now guidelines for what can and can't happen with that. And also, they've made it a rule where if it is a general and open casting call, you can't have a fee. You can't say, oh, here's a general casting call, but you have to pay $500 for us to consider you for audition. Because while the $500 number I pulled out of my butt, I just guessed a number, having fees for general auditions was something that would happen. And it's nonsense. Again, the union kind of looking out to the people trying to break in, or the people who aren't established names, aren't getting regular work, and just need better opportunities and need to not be fleeced and have themselves taken advantage of for nonsense reasons. Again, these are good guardrails to have. But that does mean that we have gotten to AI. So here's where things get tricky and messy. I think part of why some people are going into this and pulling it apart and looking for every possible way it can be taken advantage of, which, like, broadly speaking, I support as a practice, because, don't trust the studios. That's why you need a contract, because you can't trust them. But I think the thing is there were a lot of hardliners out there, whether they were actual members of the union or not. I think in general, there's a lot of hardliners who wanted the knees taken out from underneath AI altogether. They wanted a hard no AI rule, which is kind of what happened with the WGA. Technically, AI is still allowed in there, but it's basically only if the writer who has already been brought onto a project agrees to work with AI and they still get paid the same as if they weren't going to work with that. So they put the control into the writer's hands, and as far as like setting up a writer's room or an overall pitch or anything like that, the WGA just went, no, you don't get to do any of that. And I think some people were hoping for something similar with the actors contract. The thing is that was never going to happen. The main reason that wasn't going to happen was because AI with the writers was largely future-proofing, or at least an attempt to future-proof, and deal with potential things that might happen later, because AI, at least so far as we are aware, hasn't really been used in the writing process. Frankly, it hasn't gotten good enough to be able to do that. AI in post-production regarding actors has been in use for a little while. Now, it was very important to put guardrails in and do all this stuff, and we're going to talk about some of the stuff that's now in the new contract. But broadly speaking, AI was already in use, because whether it be just a little tweak to an image using an AI algorithm or assistance, or slight altering of the image, or a lot of things like the de-aging that has a lot of AI involved. AI is already a component to a fair amount of post-production special effects work. So this wasn't just a case of we have to stop them from getting in the door. They're already in the door. So you have to deal with the ways in which it is already being used while trying to stop it being abused in other ways later. So anybody who was hoping for a hard no AI, honestly, I don't think that was realistic. Would I have preferred that personally? Well, yeah, kind of. But I don't think that was ever realistically going to happen. The main thing about AI was cutting off the ability to take advantage in ways that just were horrible. Some of the things that it was rumored the studios were proposing and wanted to be able to do were awful, but AI is already a thing. You can't just get rid of it completely. It's become ingrained in small ways in too many productions. And I'll actually talk about some of the ways AI has been getting used, because it comes up in an interesting way that, again, I've seen interpreted in odd ways in some places. But okay, let's get to this. Now, the AI section is long and it's complex, and a lot of it is definitions of AI, definitions of specific types of AI, whether it is an independent creation or if it's derivative of an existing performance. There are actually different terminologies for all these different uses. So a lot of what's in there is defining terms, which, especially with something like this that doesn't have common use parlance, where if you use this term, everyone understands it to mean X thing, you need to do a lot of definition. So there's a lot of that there. And the main thing, the term you will see come up frequently is consent. Not just that consent needs to be acquired, but it needs to be very clear, and they actually have it laid out at pretty much nearly every type. No matter what it is, if you are applying AI to an actor's performance or using their performance as a basis for AI, consent has to be attained, whether it be at the time of the initial work or if you're adding it in as a new thing, you need to get consent on that. There's also a lot of structure for residuals on this. So, for example, if a digital duplicate is created of a performer and is used either in a film for their whole performance or for certain parts of a film, like if they weren't able to shoot at this location, they use a digital double, they do have to compensate that performer for as many days as they would have been on set had they been there to shoot it themselves. And also, this applies to background performers, so this one's big, they have to be given residuals based off screen time exactly the same as if they had been filmed as opposed to had been digitally duplicated. So these were some of the kinds of things that there were a lot of concerns about. And as I said, consent is a big one, and it's there a lot, and it's there pretty much following every definition that goes down the list. Now, there is one section, and this is one of the things that I think a lot of people, they saw the heading and they kind of freaked. And I get why, But this is kind of what I mean when I say some people seem to have just come in with the harshest possible read and like have just assumed everything AI related since it didn't say no AI must be a problem. And that in that there is a section for exceptions to consent. Now, as a phrase, that sounds bad. If there's all these things in place, like, well, you can't duplicate me without consent, and you can't do this without consent, you can't alter my performance without consent, you can't do these things, but then there's a section for exceptions to consent. That seems bad. But if you look at it, this is basically codifying the stuff that's already kind of standard, and that I think at least is pretty harmless. So some of the specific things include minor alterations to, say, costuming. Say a performer's costume looks wrong. They get into the editing suite and it was lit in such a way that it does not look like the color that it was supposed to. And they decide to use AI to alter that color rather than having to go in and do it manually. That would be allowed without consent. If they used AI to get like a loose strand of hair out of somebody's face, that could be done without consent. If they used AI to fix a little bit of lip sync, if they'd had to dub over a performance after the fact because maybe there was too much on-set sound, but now the audio track they have doesn't fully match up with the lip movements, and they use AI to better sync the lips to the sound, that would be permissible without consent. So these kinds of tiny post-production tweaks that are already the most common use of AI in post-production, those are allowed without consent. Now, again, coming back to what I said way at the start, the definitions of these things matter, and their clarifications for the extent that it is allowed to happen without consent is also very important. But again, what I have is a summary, not the full thing. And based off the summary and at least the spirit of this, I understand why these exceptions to consent are there, because these are the kind of tiny tweaks that have already become kind of standard in the production pipeline. And if they have to halt post-production for every little correction of this nature in order to attain permission again from an actor and to get consent to adjust tiny things like fixing a stray hair, removing blinks if somebody is meant to be playing like an android or something, or fixing or color correcting, or removing like a single wrinkle off a face that they decide they don't want there, or what have you, that would become, frankly, a bureaucratic mess if they had to stop and get permission for every single instance like that every single time. Now, again, the specifics of this do matter. The specifics that I don't have, and neither does anybody else who is not actually in the union, at least so far as I know. All I've seen that's been put out is the summary, and generally that's the way it goes. But I think that the idea of these exceptions makes sense. Is it abusable? Depends on the specific wording, but at least in concept, I don't think this is the end of the world. There's also one other area where I've seen people get nervous, and this has to do with a section under independently created digital replicas. Basically, these aren't necessarily being based off of scans or off of a performance. They're being created independent of a normal piece of contracted work that an actor would be involved in. And under that, there are some more exceptions, which basically tries to account for fair use, so that any situation where it would normally be acceptable to use clips of an actor, be it from a movie, be it from an interview, be it images, etc., if it would be acceptable to use them under standard fair use rules, it would also be acceptable to make use of an independently created digital replica of that performer. This is probably the one that has the most potential for abuse, depending on how everything is very specifically laid out in the full contract. In the summary, some examples that it gives would be comment, criticism, scholarship, satire, or parody, use in a docudrama or historical or biographical work. Again, kind of defaulting to what would standardly fall under fair use. But in the summary, at least, there's no language indicating that a digital replica can't be used to say something that the person never said, or like there's no evidence they ever said that, but you make them say it anyway just to make it seem authentic. That is the kind of thing that could be a concern, because even if you mark it under parody, well, as we've seen on Twitter when the blue check mark went up for sale, even if something appears like it should be parody, if at first glance it looks authentic, it can cause big problems. So while I understand the concerns about stepping on First Amendment and fair use rights in regards to these specific exceptions, I would say that depending on how things are defined in the full contract, this is the one area where there's some holes here. But it is worth noting that as far as major studios are concerned, they're really not going to be able to take advantage of this because none of what they are doing that they normally hire these actors for fall under these exceptions. But it does still leave open the possibility of basically malicious mischief. Another thing that's in there, like as a phrase that I think freaked a lot of people out, was the idea that death does not discharge consent. And I think that gave people flashbacks to the stories we'd had before of studios wanting to be able to scan an actor once and then use that scan and that data in perpetuity in anything for forever, even after the person's dead, and they just get to own that. And that was a very scary prospect. But the thing about the consent not being discharged upon death, unless otherwise specified in a contract, is kind of a standard thing. Basically, what that means is you already gave your informed, and again, the specifics are probably going to be in the full contract, but these things don't just say consent in like, oh, you can sneak it in. They're like, people have to be clear. They have to know. And there's rules for arbitration if someone is going to dispute that consent was not properly informed, and all that's aside, all that's in there as well. But if you have given your consent that your digital duplicate can be utilized in this film, after you die, they are still allowed to use it in that film. It doesn't grant them new abilities to do with your digital duplicate anything they couldn't do before. What it does is it makes clear that when you're dead, your existing consent for the ways in which it was used still remain, because otherwise it opens up the possibility of the people who end up running the estate of a deceased actor or possibly their next of kin or whoever might be around that has a legal claim could make demands to renegotiate, re-up, or get a new payment to basically sign off again now that they're dead. This, again, kind of thing is fairly standard. A lot of contracts are designed to still be valid even after somebody dies. Some are designed to be void upon somebody's death, and it can vary. It isn't necessarily automatically one or the other, but that's why there's clarifying language in this. Now, in theory, if somebody did get kind of conned into signing away more rights than they realized they were, and there's this it doesn't discharge with death thing, is that a little scary? Yeah, a little bit, but you kind of jumped over a problem that needs to be dealt long before with somebody dying, which is that we need to address people getting signed into contracts that are coercive or in some way not properly explained to them, which, again, this contract does attempt to do in fairly broad ways, but again, it's a summary. It's going to be a little bit broad. So that was another thing that I saw a lot of people freaking out about that I wanted to get some clarification in there on, again, to the best of my knowledge. There's also an interesting thing about synthetic performers, these being ones that are not based off an actor. So they didn't scan somebody, they didn't motion capture anybody's performance. They're just creating with AI tools, usually a crowd or something of that nature. Now, the contract does something interesting with that, which is that it doesn't strictly forbid it, but it basically requires any given movie that wants to do that to make a case before the union as to why they should be allowed to do that with AI tools instead of making use of actual actors. And also there's a caveat that it does not apply to non-human actors. So it won't apply if they need, to create a stampede with a mass of animals, or if it's a huge crowd of aliens in a Star Wars movie. That they can just go ahead and do. But if it is meant to be people, there is some language in there to, at the very least, not just give free rein to studios to just fill out crowds with nothing but AI-derived actors, that aren't even necessarily based off anybody, at least in theory. There's a whole side conversation to be had about generative AI and how generative it is as opposed to actually stealing people's work and likenesses and recobbling it together. But that is a much larger discussion that's probably going to have to play out in court over the next decade or so to figure out how that's exactly going to work. But again, I feel like most things are at least attempting to be addressed in this. From my vantage point, that of a semi-educated commentator, most points that I've seen be issues are addressed. The question is, are they addressed as thoroughly as they could be and as foolproof as they could be? And there are definitely some people out there who have seen who believe that that is not the case. Again, though, I caution against being overly granular and picking apart the summary because it is just a summary. But there is certainly still concern that the way these things are worded might still give some leeway, might still allow the studios to do more than the spirit of the agreement was intended to allow them to do. And those are legitimate concerns, and we'll see how they play out in the next few years. It is worth noting this contract is only for 3 years, and while 3 years technologically can mean a lot, ultimately, especially with everything having been pushed back months, if not a year, if not 2 years on some schedules, 3 years is not that long. Where if the studios start taking advantage of the way these things are worded, it's gonna come up again in contract negotiations in not that far in the future. And no, that's not me saying like, any problems, we'll patch it later. No, I'm not Bethesda. No, if there are problems, ideally they shouldn't be there in the first place, and addressed right now would be preferable. But it's not like they're locked into this forever. They have a fairly short amount of time before the next contract comes up, and if the holes have started to show with this agreement, particularly in regards to the AI, they will have the chance to address and plug them. Now, there is still some danger there, because remember how I said before that part of why this is more complicated because AI has already become standard to a certain degree. If some sneaky found a loophole use of AI and or rights to people's likenesses and performances starts to become standard before the next contract comes up, that could be a problem. But again, that is kind of going down the what if path. Like, is that possible? Yeah. It's hard to know, though. Are these 100% foolproof? Probably not. But how much the studios are actually going to be able to get away with in a way that won't ultimately just bite them in the ass when we get around to the next negotiating phase, and especially considering that Congress has considered looking at putting forth legislation to restrict the use of generative AI in creative fields. I don't necessarily expect that that will happen because Congress is a dysfunctional mess, but it's been proposed. And by and large, as with the writers, the vast majority of people are on the actors' side. The studios don't have a lot of backing on this. And while there was no call for a consumer boycott this strike, I think that it's pretty clear just from the hit that was taken from actors not going out and promoting this stuff. And like, there's a number of reasons that some high profile flaws have happened, but that certainly hasn't helped while the strike has been going on. If the actors felt they were getting screwed so badly they actually called for a consumer boycott, I don't think the studios can afford to dance with that. Now, I've said in the past that boycotts don't work, but I've said that in the sense of like consumer organized, like, you know, boycotts of a video game, of this show, of this studio. Generally, no, they don't. And that's not to say you shouldn't stand by your principles and not put money towards something, by all means. But if the actual performers, the people who, you know, audiences like, said that we are getting screwed over, please help us not be screwed over, would it be most audiences? No, probably not. Would it be enough to be a immediate noticeable problem? Yeah, it would. So I'm not a doomerist on this. I look at this and to my eyes, my untrained, my not a contract lawyer eyes, this seems like it's definitely making a solid attempt to address everything. Is there stuff that I can't think of that might have holes? Yeah, no, absolutely. That is distinctly possible. But I think a lot of people who are doing the harshest possible read are assuming a level of cavalier malice on the parts of the studios that I think is a little unreasonable. Now, this is not me giving benefit of the doubt to studios. They're corporations. Screw them. But they do still have people to answer to, be it shareholders, be it board members, be it whatever else. And this strike did not do well for the studios. So they're probably not going to have a lot of backing even internally for another move to tick off the unions. I think the way that these strikes have gone is a way that is going to overall strengthen them and make the studios a bit more cautious about brazenly being the kinds of jackasses that negotiations prior to them finally settling on this indicated they really wanted to be. I don't doubt that studios want to be able to pay an actor for their likeness once, record some voice lines for them, never pay them again, and use their image as AI forever. I don't doubt that they want to do that. But I do doubt that they think they could get away with that right now, at least anytime soon. And that's a start. Is that everything? Well, no. Keep a vigilant eye on corporations, always and forever. But I'm still feeling largely positive about this, while acknowledging that maybe there's some holes, and maybe in a year's time I'll be eating my words because there was a massive hole that I didn't see. But from where I sit, this definitely the non-AI stuff I think is pretty much all good. And the AI related stuff, the spirit of it, I'm 100% behind, and I don't know enough about contract law to say whether the specifics will net the intended result. But I'm hopeful, and I'm certainly glad to see, the studios cave. There's a catharsis to a few weeks ago them going to the actors, offering their best and final offer, the actors walking away, and then the studios coming back a week later with a different offer than their best and final offer. I'm going to take my my catharsis in that and be happy with it, because, could use a win in some things. This has been a heck of a year, and I'll take a win where I can get it. Is it a total win? Nah. But I think it's a net positive. So that's my overview for the SAG-AFTRA ending of the strike, the proposed contract that needs to be ratified. My overall thoughts on it, as I said, some people are not positive on it at all. That feels overly pessimistic to me, but again, that's just where I'm at. What do you think? What are your thoughts on any of this? Even if you disagree with me and you think I'm a fool, you can disagree with me. Just, let's not do name calling and accusing anybody of being a shill or being paid or anything else. The only people paying me are my Patreon. Support me over there to keep this whole thing up and running. But other than that, I want to hear your thoughts. Drop them down in the comments. Let's talk about it. There are other things that I do around the net. You can check out links in the description. But what I really want you to remember is that you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You are the council, and I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. Time to thank some patrons, and this time I'm going to say their names as if I'm greeting them, welcoming them to a party. Robin Moore, Zuman Lafula, Goddess Elida, Tarak, the thing that goes doink in the anime, Ruth, Gozer the Gozerian, Oliver B, Solitary Pictures, Ulrich Bogdan, Melinda Walters, Jen, Auntie Kate 808, Becky Sparks, Phenomenalax the Poodle, Robin Powell, T Love, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperl, Dave Hall, Rosalind Bennett. Have fun tonight, and thank you for your support. I don't know why I decided to do that this time, but I don't know. I'm having fun.